Okay, so now it's 7:15, and I'm glad to start the concluding session of the second day of the conference. Unfortunately, we have a change in the program since Professor Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern wouldn't be able to attend today. And this is my pleasure to present, just a minute. Rafi, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, excellent. This is my pleasure to present my colleague, Rafi Tsirkin-Sadan, senior lecturer in the Department of Literature and Arts at the Open University of Israel. His research interests include Russian literature, modern Jewish literature in the European context, poetics of empire, history of literary theory and criticism, and East European studies. Rafi published multiple articles and 2 books in Hebrew. The first, Jewish Letters in the Pushkin Library, Yosef Chaim Brenner's Thought and its Connection to Russian Literature and Thought in 2013. And the second book, Wandering Heroes, Committed Writers, Nihilists and Nihilism in Russian Literature, 1862-66 in 2015. His today's talk is titled Empire, Cosmopolitanism and Nationalism in Vladimir Jabotinsky's Samson. Please, Rafi, the stage is yours, and you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sveta. Can you hear me? Great. In the last years, there is an increasing interest in Israeli and American scholarship in the personality, the political thought, and the literary work of Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, the ideologist and the founder of the right-wing revisionist Zionism. Beside him being a political leader, Jabotinsky was involved in various kinds of literary activity. Born and raised in Odessa, he made a living by writing journalism in Russian on European politics. He wrote poetry and was involved in translating poetry into Russian and Hebrew. In addition, Jabotinsky wrote fiction in Russian. The novel Samson, published in 1926, is probably his most famous piece, written in a mixed genre of adventure story and historical novel. Samson's adventures in the novel include war against the Philistines, hunting scenes, and passionate romantic relationships. The novel also deals with issues of identity and belonging. Like his character, Jabotinsky was a man of contradictions and oppositions. In his writings, the following dichotomies are especially apparent: nationalism or cosmopolitanism, Jewish solidarity or local patriotism to his hometown, Odessa. All these dichotomies were extensively discussed in the research literature, and some of the scholars attend this meeting. In today's presentation, I will discuss the novel Samson as a case study of East-West relations and the relationship between imperial orientation and the aesthetic ideology. As we shall see, Jabotinsky is turning to the adventure genre, more typical to the English literary tradition, does not solely express literary taste. To Jabotinsky's mind, adventure genre is an important part in the system of values associated with the British Empire, which he believed stands as a guardian of Western civilization. Therefore, British Empire may serve as a construction factor in the Jewish national project. This position was accompanied by a revision of the role of the Russian Empire and Russian literature in Jewish history and culture. A few words about the novel. Samson mainly deals with the conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines, and Samson's back and forth movement between the world of his people, which he finds primitive, and the worlds of their enemies, which he admires. Samson's deeds in the novel, the wars with Philistines, him being a judge, and the love story with Delilah are based on the biblical story. In addition, Samson tries to unite the Israelites and make peace with the old native population in the land of Israel. All these issues are not mentioned in the biblical story. The author's time is also present in the novel. The place of the story is the land of Israel of ancient times, but it also refers to the places which have shaped Jabotinsky's life, his hometown Odessa, the Jewish Pale of settlement in Russia, mandatory Palestine, and Western Europe. It is clear that the novel contains the immediate political context, that is the rise of Jewish nationalism and the conquest of Palestine by the British. Thus, we can see the conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines in Samson also as an allegory to the increasing tension between the Zionist movement and the British in the 1920s. The Philistines who ruled the land are described in the novel as Western powerful nation with supreme technology and organization. However, their superiority is threatened by the Israelites who, led by Samson, attempt to adopt their advanced technology and military skills. Both Israelites and Philistines are presented as invaders. Israelites came from the big desert in the east, Philistines came from the Greek islands. The native population, the Canaanites, is described as an inferior ethnic group with no claim to sovereignty. Moreover, the use of the word tuzemцы in Russian natives when characterizing Canaanites immediately triggers the conquering distant land by imperial powers. These associations put the novel in the context of a colonial discourse. Even if the Israelites' goal in the novel is national liberation and not colonialist occupation, its achievement demands imitating the cultural codes of the Western power. Samson spends much time among the Philistines, learning their ways in order to teach them to his people. The first stage in promoting the national goal is changing the cultural orientation and fully adopting Western values as an alternative to Eastern primitivity. The second stage is in achieving this goal is fighting against any other hegemonic power for control over the territory. However, Samson's attraction to the Philistines' Western culture clearly results from his disgust from the Israelite culture and the way of life. Samson feels much better with the Philistines. He prefers to spend his time with them, hunting, drinking, and womanizing. Every contact with the Israelites is painful and accompanied by the feeling of his foreignness. Many times, Samson expresses a strong repulsion towards their manners and religious practices. Thus, for example, in one of Samson's encounters with the Jebusites, robbers and worshippers of the god Zion Azazel in Jerusalem, he takes them to a public bathhouse in order to remove from them the smell of the god feces, which they liked more than the smell of humans. The situation is most comic. Laughter for Samson is the primarily means, alongside king's rule and weapons production, in turning Israelites into nations similar to the one of the Philistines. The Jebusites in the novel presented as a native Canaanite, but Jabotinsky uses the religious practice in Jerusalem in order to criticize the bad manners of Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem and in Eastern Europe. Their bad manners are a symptom of a political and cultural backwardness. In fact, Jabotinsky also portrays the people of Israel as a typical Eastern nation who belong to Asia and the big desert far away from Europe. Yet the belief in mending the cultural backwardness presented by Samson indicates that the concept of East is based on a situational rather than essential definition. Jabotinsky expressed explicitly his views on this topic in a programmatic article, The East, which was published in the same year as the novel Samson. In the article, Jabotinsky identifies the East with backwardness, fatalism, clericalism, and the lack of political talent. The West is identified with progress and initiative. However, East is not presented is not presented an essential term, but a historical stage which can be passed. Jabotinsky believes that the Jewish nationalist project, based on Western values in politics and culture, can turn Jews into true Western nation. So does Samson. All Samson's political and military actions include an act of imitation of a Philistine culture, that is, the Western culture. It seems that by imitating the Western hegemonic ruler, Israelites can turn from a gathering of tribes into a nation. Only after becoming a nation can they claim for sovereignty in the land of Israel. It is clear that the establishment of sovereignty includes confrontation with the hegemonic power. The conflict between the Israelites and Philistines in the novel indeed hints, first and foremost, the tension between the Jewish national movement and the British Empire, but it can also be understood to point to the complex relationship between modern Jewish nationalism and Russian imperialism. During most of the 19th century, the Russian Empire played a positive role in the modernization of the Jews in Eastern Europe. However, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the Russian Empire became a reactionary force adopting explicitly anti-Semitic policy. This development led to the national and Zionist turn in Jewish politics and culture, which involved changing the imperial orientation. In the early 20th century, the British Empire was not merely a central diplomatic factor in Zionist politics, but also represented progressive Western values. Jabotinsky's thought explicitly reflects the changes in the imperial orientation in Russian Jewish politics. To his mind, while the British Empire represents progress in the West, the Russian Empire is revealed as an agent of Eastern despotism, an obstacle of modernization. In fact, Jabotinsky perceives Russia as part of the East. Following the failure of 1905 revolution, Jabotinsky took extremely critical position towards Russian culture and politics. In the note, Your Happy New Year in 1908, which can be seen only as a swan song of Russian liberalism, Jabotinsky declared on disengagement from Russian politics and culture. To his mind, the Russian culture does not longer fulfill the civilizing function for the Jews. An imperial constructive option must be looked for. Very soon, Jabotinsky turns to the British option. Jabotinsky's political activity vis-a-vis British Empire was described in details in the research, so I'm not going to do into it right now. At this point, I just want to emphasize that Jabotinsky's shift in imperial orientation has literary aspects as well. At this point, I would like to know that Jabotinsky had a quiet and ambivalent attitude towards the classic Russian literature of the 19th century, and Professor Horowitz had mentioned this yesterday. In this essay, the 10 books written on the eve of the Russian Revolution of 1905, Jabotinsky has tried to compose the literary canon for the Russian educated reader. This list included only one Russian writer, Dostoevsky. The rest of the list includes the Bible, Homer, Boccaccio, 1001 Nights, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Byron, and Goethe. The great Russian poets and writers Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Chekhov are not included. In this essay and in other places, Jabotinsky rejects the obsession of Russian classical writers with philosophical and psychological issues. The diamond questions, proklятые вопросы, are simply boring for him. He prefers a story with an intrigue and adventure which might be useful in education of a free and initiative individual. In this sense, Jabotinsky's choice of adventure genre for Samson reaffirms his argumentation in compiling a Western canon. Adventure stories for young readers are supposed to supply them with an appropriate aesthetic education, relying on the element of action and initiative. In short, Jabotinsky would have wanted to see more works such as those of Cooper, Kipling, Stevenson, and Defoe. They are part of the canon. Jabotinsky's choice to write an historical novel according to the model of the English adventure story is by all means an act of decolonization from the Russian imperial culture and on the one hand, and the recolonization to the British imperial culture on the other. The search for an appropriate genre for the national aesthetic education dictates the imperial orientation and vice versa. Russian literature has, in his view, aesthetic norms which are not appropriate for the Jewish national project, mainly because of its inability to serve as a model to educating a free and initiative individual. On the contrary, English and West European literatures can be useful for that case. I think that you can see here the interconnections between the aesthetics, between ideology of aesthetics and political ideology of liberalism. All this leads to a question. Why did Jabotinsky choose to write Samson in Russian in the first place? I don't think that there is a clear answer to this. His command of Hebrew was very good, and in fact, he began to write the novel in Hebrew in Latin letters, but at some point he switched to Russian. Perhaps because writing in Russian just came natural to him. Perhaps he was thinking about his audience in Eastern Europe, much of it saw Russian as a language of higher culture. Jabotinsky's pro-Western and philo-British orientation dictated not only his attitude toward the Russian culture, but also his attitude toward the modern Jewish culture which developed in Eastern Europe. Except of Chaim Nachman Bialik, whom he admired and translated into Russian, Jabotinsky has no mentioning of Hebrew modernists in his writings. The silence is very significant and sign of indifference or objection. I think that this position has much more in common with objection than with indifference. It seems that for Jabotinsky, the Hebrew literature of the beginning of the 20th century, which was hardly influenced by Russian classical novels, is not appropriate to the Zionist youth who needed a Bildungsroman in the form of an exciting historical adventure story and not a web of psychological and moral pickings. Jabotinsky does not reject the ideological function of the literature, but requires to fulfill it by producing the reading experience, which urges political heroic action. In this aspect, Samson can really be read as a Zionist Bildungsroman and as a manifesto of radical Zionism. Jabotinsky's Samson reminds not only the classical biblical hero, but also Heracles and Fenimore Cooper's characters. He reminds of Indian chief. It's also possible to identify Nietzschean motives in Samson's character. His physical strength and mental virtues make him the embodiment of the supreme man, Übermensch. Samson's admiration of military power of the Philistines hints on the affinity to the Nietzsche's call for replacement of the Judeo-Christian morals by Greco-Roman values. Moreover, it seems that Jabotinsky identifies the Judeo-Christian morals with the East. On the contrary, Greco-Roman values represented by Philistines are very essence of the West. The dichotomy between Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman values is analogous to the dichotomy between the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, with all its questions of identity and belonging. The questions of identity and belonging has greatly preoccupied Jabotinsky. In fact, these questions lie in the center of the plot of Samson, since protagonist's familial and national origin serves as the novel's intrigue. His mother is an Israelite. The identity of the father is not clear. The father might be Philistine, Israelite, and the native Canaanite. Father's unclear identity connected to the question of belonging. Does Samson belong to the Israelites and the East, or does he belong to the Philistines and the West? Israelites in the novel believe his father to be a Philistine. His strength is a sign of his foreignness, and this is the reason why they turn away from him. Philistines believe that he belongs to the people of Israel. Only the native Canaanites accept him without any questions. In many ways, Samson's behavior reminds Jabotinsky's own position in the Jewish politics. By all means, Jabotinsky was an outsider in the Zionist movement. He was raised in the big city, not in a small town in the Jewish Jewish Pale of settlement. He wasn't familiar with traditional Jewish education, and like many Zionist leaders, he rejected socialism. It seems that Jabotinsky felt much better at the cafes and nightclubs in Paris than at the meetings of Zionist Congress. For all his life, he didn't stop missing Odessa with its light and free cosmopolitan spirit. After reading Samson, one may conclude that in Jabotinsky's eyes, in order to be a Zionist, you should be less Jewish. The question is it this possible? The tragic end of the novel shows that the answer is probably no. In the end, Samson destroys the Philistine temple after Delilah informs him that she gave birth to their son and that she intends to raise him to the hatred of Israel. Samson cannot bear this. Destroying the temple brings about the death of his son, who was born as a result of Samson's love to Philistine Western culture. Despite his deep love, Philistines don't accept Samson as one of their own. It is as if Jabotinsky says that the Jews may change their imperial orientation and improve their ways, but it's doubtful if these changes would affect how they will be perceived by others. It appears that the West does not meet its own universal standards. From this point, it is the direct way to extremely pessimistic nationalism, which can be found in Jabotinsky's writing in the 30s, and I will stop right now.
Thank you very much, Rafi. Israel, yes, for wonderful talk. Israel put his finger that you want to ask a question. Israel Bartal. Unmute yourself, please.
Could you elaborate on the ambiguity of the place of Hebrew as kind of a gateway to the West in that regard? In Jabotinsky's mind, in Jabotinsky's writing, and especially in this case of using a biblical ancient story in order to convey Western ideas.
Well, so, I think that in that case he continues the tradition of Jewish Enlightenment that also saw Hebrew as a gateway to the Western culture at least medium term. So I think that this turn to Bible, I think it's clear combination of Haskalah tradition and Tchiyah tradition. But I think that he also the biblical themes also can be found in Russian literature of that time. So in these topics, I think that he combines both of the traditions, the Jewish Enlightenment and Russian literature, because I also must stress the importance of biblical themes in the silver Russian literature. So I think that we must understand Jabotinsky's writings in this context.
Yes, and I would love you to elaborate more about this dynamic between decolonization and recolonization, and like simultaneous decolonization and recolonization, because indeed someone might say that there was an aspect of hypocrisy in this dynamics of perceiving himself as decolonizing Jew, freeing himself from Russian colonialism, and then imagining himself colonizing Palestine and Jabotinsky, unlike labor movement oriented writers, he was absolutely aware and did not heed his colonization dreams. So maybe you can elaborate on this.
Well, I feel actually like that this question, it goes back to his Odessa background, because Israel, you spoke about this yesterday, and I think that the empire is not a bad thing in Odessa, the empire. And the southern Russia was perceived in Russian literature as a frontier that must be colonized. And I think that when we speak about this decolonization, recolonization, we must keep in mind also the representation of frontier in Russian literature of the like Lermontov and Pushkin and Tolstoy. So I think also the context is very important to Jabotinsky. And I think also like Odessan Jews in collaboration with empire, it's very natural, and it doesn't contradict his national affiliation or Odessa patriotism.
Yes, thank you very much, Rafi, for the answer. And Miria Leke asks, the writers of the Odessa school and avant-garde in Odessa literature also oriented themselves toward Western literature, British among others. Is this similar orientation connected, or perhaps it's a shared fashion, on your opinion?
Well, I really don't know. I know very little about Odessan modernism. So, but yes, it's like very very similar to me. But I can give you very good answer to this question. Sorry.
If I might add, and actually it pertains to the question Scott asked yesterday, and I couldn't answer it immediately, about the specificities of autobiographical narratives of Odessa. We might say, I was speaking about narratives according to differentiation of literature, because in Hebrew it's written differently and in Russian differently. And then this is a gender differentiation. And when we speak about male narratives from the 20s and 30s, we can speak about perception of Odessa as a site of adventure. In Jabotinsky's autobiography, in Kataev's autobiography, in Olesha's autobiographical writings, and it's all feeded from the common bookshelf, so to say. And I think this foundation, and it's interesting, why, and we can discuss it further, why is it so? But and perhaps just port and seeing ships coming and going all the time is very. It helps to imagine, to develop adventure imagination. Now to Scott's question to Rafi. To what do you accredit the renewed interest in Jabotinsky and his literature over the past few years?
Well, I think that probably many Israeli liberals are trying to present like Jabotinsky as a liberal thinker, and I think it's true in many ways, because I really think that if he will try to be accepted, to put his membership like in Labour Party today, he probably will not be accepted, because he was a real Democrat. He was a real liberal. He was. I know. All this discussion about his fascism and so on, but I think that probably explains the interest in his idea. His liberalism, his liberal, his openness to Western culture, and I think that this can explain this.
Yes, and Alexis asks a technical question. Do we know if Jabotinsky read Kipling in Russian or in English?
Oh, absolutely, he read it in English, absolutely. His command of English was perfect, like other European languages. So I'm pretty sure that he read it in English.
Okay, so is there any other question? Because our time is coming to end. So thank you very much, Rafi. Thank you to all the participants. Brian asks question. His view of Judaism is strange. What about religion? Yeah, his view of Judaism is strange. What about religion?
Oh, he was absolutely secular. I think that probably it's also, I think that it can explain the interest of the Israeli liberals or liberal scholars in his ideas. He was absolutely secular, and it's very clear in his article "The West." He completely rejects religion as a part of the part of Eastern culture identity, and so on. So I think that probably he was the one in the Zionist movement in the beginning of the 20th century that was completely secular.
So thank you very much to Rafi and to all the participants. And we meet each other tomorrow at 4 p.m. Israeli time, which is same in Ukraine. So we can say Odessa time. Thank you very much again, and good evening.
Thank you for sharing.